Malfeasance is an exotic that used to be considered pretty aggressively average, but after just a few buffs, and it's now constantly contending for a top DPS spot for primaries. Sweet Business, an exotic that rarely, if ever, got used, received a rather hilarious buff, and now, well, it's okay, but it's more fun now. But are there any exotic weapons that still need some tuning? Let's take a look at some of the worst exotic weapons and how to fix them. Topping my list for weapons that could really use a buff, Cerberus. Cerberus is, in theory, one of my favorite weapons in the game. However, in practice, like many exotics on this list, it feels like an active handicap. Cerberus has always felt like a weird crossbreed between an SMG and an auto rifle. Too long range to be an SMG and too close range to be an auto, and not great at either of these playstyles. While this weapon does have a very particular niche with Behemoth Titans inside of Trials, I feel like having it used for 0.1% of all scenarios in the game hardly justify it being correctly balanced. But how do we fix it? We change how its catalyst functions. While its normal fire mode is fine enough, it still is passable enough for it to do its job and sometimes see play for the cultists known as off-meta players. Its catalyst, however, at best is a joke, and at worst is a selectable death sentence. Its catalyst, for some strange reason, not only massively slows its fire rate, but also massively reduces its range, with the only benefit being that you get a tighter spread, which for the people keeping track at home, that's two downsides for one upside, which doesn't make sense for me on something that's supposed to improve the weapon. So let's keep it simple here and remove that range penalty. I personally would love to see it get both unstoppable rounds to stun champions and explosive rounds to follow in its funny entrepreneurial older brother's footsteps. But I can already hear the Geneva Convention calling, and they don't sound happy. Not to be outdone, the exotic class specific glaives, specifically the warlocks. Glaives in general are like a trigger word to start a fight, because some people can't stand to use them and some people can't stand to fight against them, and this glaive is the worst offender of both. I almost don't want to suggest a buff to this weapon because it is the one thing the Destiny community can actually agree upon. The Edge of Intent has an exotic trait which makes it fire a healing turret once you reach full glaive energy. And that's it. That's the whole exotic. I feel like how hard it is to get footage for an exotic is a decently accurate depiction of how bad the exotic is, and after finally getting a half-decent game with this thing, I understand why the suicide rates are an all-time high now. But how do we fix it? Well, short of an entire glaive overhaul, it really doesn't make sense to use this exotic when both the boots of the assembler and the Lumina are just right there, and both will do far more for far less effort. I think making the glaive continuously grant health to nearby allies and yourself while blocking would actually allow this glaive to fulfill the Battle Mercy playstyle it is trying to cosplay as. If not that, then maybe make the healing turret cost ammo instead of glaive energy, that way you can have it up more often. But hey, speaking of disappointing things, Truth used to be a long-range DDoS attack on a player's heartbeat. I remember this thing landing on the top of my head like Tom Brady in his prime with a mechanical steroid pumping implant, and nowadays the weapon can barely even be called an exotic, with nearly every asset it has being power crept by even a legendary rocket launcher. Worse still is that it can't gain Gallahorn's Wolfpack rounds, and if you can't galley, why even bother showing up to the party? This weapon is an artifact of Destiny 1, and it really shows. Everything is harder, better, faster, stronger in Destiny 2. A cool idea I heard was to make the explosions suck targets in like a vortex grenade, and while this would be cool, I don't think it would actually solve any of its major meta problems. So instead, what if it also granted a small chunk of void overshield, making certain Titan playstyles incredibly synergistic with it? Hell, even if it got full court as an exotic catalyst, that would help. Anything at this point. It feels more like a really bad and practical joke to equip this thing in 2023. The same could be said of Lord of Wolves. you know, a lot of people don't know about this exotic is that it has a hidden perk called PTSD, where if you fire this weapon around a veteran PvP player, they will hear the starting guitar riff to the classic rock song Fortunate Sons. Besides that, this weapon really doesn't do much. It plays like a shotgun and a fusion rifle had a baby, and I wish I could call nature beautiful in this case, but really I just want to take it out back in Old Yeller the Thing. Outclassed in PvE and inconsistent in PvP, Lord of Wolves is now a lone wolf because it has... Okay, the joke sounded better in my head, alright? I'm tempted to say just give it scorch damage on crits or something of the like, just because it worked for things like Skybirders and Sunshot, but that seems too smooth-brained for my liking, not creative enough. Instead, what if this gave nearby shotgun users a buff to fire rate and granted them cure whenever you got a kill? Basically, what if the Lord of Wolves became the Gallahorn of shotguns? This wouldn't fix its issue in PvP, but it would at least have a shot in PvE where this weapon is likely to best fit into. Oh, by the way, my analytics show that exactly 100% of you are subscribed to the channel, so good job on that. Next up, the next choice is a bit odd, but hear me out. Vigilant Swing. Vigiwing is the diaper and training wheels of primary exotics. It rewards the user for people doing a bad job nearby you. It rewards people for taking a shit. This weapon isn't necessarily bad per se, it's more like, if you were to compare it to literally every other exotic pulse in the game, it feels like the junior higher of the bunch. Its TTK is respectable, getting close to what that coveted 0.8 second average is, but where it falls flat is in its perks. Besides firing a 5-round burst at a time and making an incredibly satisfying sound, this gun grants you a boost to healing and movement when someone dies near you. Now, on paper, this would be great for quick play PvP, right? Teammates are dying all the time. But no, its rewards aren't enough to see this weapon more than it is likely to find a car in the road that isn't some shade of white or black. I think simply making the burst fire faster would help a lot to make this weapon feel a little more punchy. You wouldn't need to spend so much time standing out in the open waiting for your long john 5-round burst shot to end. You could instead do that peeky pokey cover thing like the cool kids do. But what if we got just a bit more creative? I think it would be just swell if this weapon healed targets when you shot them. Make this weapon into a pure support weapon with defensive and offensive potential. Bungie has already teased something similar to this for the final shape, so why not play test a little bit of it right now? But I at least generally like pulse rifles, not so much for trace rifles like the Prometheus Lens. For a special weapon scorch causing tool, this weapon sure does feel like a worse version of literally every other scorch causing primary in the game. Most trace rifles have done a pretty good job of maintaining some asset that distinguishes them from everything else in the game, whether it's Divinity's damage boost and ease of use, Cold Heart's access to bonus damage and ionic traces. You get the picture. What does Prometheus Lens do? Not much. Prolonged fire causes targets to gain scorch, and the beam will grow bigger for wherever it's landing. Why not just use the buff Tommy's Matchbook that does the exact same thing, minus the beam and requiring special ammo? Oh, but let's not forget the biggest game-changing and exotic perk in the game! Subsistence, basically, but it's exotics. Yeah, I don't understand the thought process here. Except for the one weekend where this weapon was obviously not working as intended, the Prometheus Lens has never had a home. On my Christmas wish list for this weapon, I would love to see all its shots scorch targets, and maybe even leave a small trail of burning napalm in its wake. We already have Skyburners that does scorch right from the hip already. Why not make a special weapon because it's doing the exact same thing? I want to make a flamethrower. That's something I can get behind. This next one sounds odd, but when's the last time you've used a Manticore? Besides being a stat monster, there isn't much reason to equip this thing while the airborne effectiveness stats exist. What confuses me more is that if there ever were to be a weapon of any type that would have near 100 AE, it should be this gun. And while it does have a slightly better stat, it isn't enough for how much this weapon wants you to be in the air. This weapon is like a party trick. Funny once or twice, but people will quickly get tired of it and then they will just shut you down. It also feels weird to me that this weapon is Void and not Strand. Like, I know this weapon released before Strand was like a thing, quote unquote, but it still doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt this weapon's synergies. With how much Bungie wants us to put like Jolt on our arc weapons, Scorch on our solar weapons, Slows on our stasis, Unraveling on strand, and Volatile on void, the idea of an airborne void weapon is like dunking Oreos in orange juice. Hell, even if this were a solar weapon, it would make more sense for at least like the solar warlocks. This weapon is in such a weird place, it's hard to buff it creatively. If it were my call, I would move it to the strand slot, and then I would make the airborne shots sever targets instead of dealing bonus damage to them. That would also make its catalyst, which reduces incoming damage, feel a little bit better too. Before we get to our final entry in our list, I want to bring up some honorable mentions. Some exotics I almost put on this list, but decided against once I actually tried them out. Firstly, Darcy. This weapon gets so much bad press you'd think its name stood for Elon Musk. In practice, I found this weapon to be slightly lackluster, sure, but honestly, incredibly fun. With how much this weapon is talked down on, I expected my time with it to be horrible, but that's not what happened at all. The weapon, I think, is meant to be more of a multi-tool. It handles adds alright with the jolt damage, and it does okay damage to bosses because of its target locking perk. There's also something incredibly satisfying about making literally every shot into a localized arc rocket jolt explosion. I recommend you give this weapon a try before you talk crap about it again. You might find yourself having a lot of fun like I did. Anyway, last honorable mention is the Heart Shadow. Because I literally never see this exotic, I almost forgot it existed. I again had bedrock expectations for this, but I really liked what I saw. I think where most people make the mistake with this weapon is that they think that it's meant to be like another Lament, another big damage dealer, but it's not. It's a utility tool through and through. Its damage isn't horrible, but it clearly isn't great either. However, the literal free loop of invisibility this grants you is insanely useful. As someone who mains Rat King, this weapon can be a clutch tool for getting in and out of bad situations with ease. Give it a try, but don't bother with the last entry on our list, the Colony. I can already feel the Cheeto-covered sweaty fingers of outraged PvP tryhards who love this weapon to death because of how easy it is to get damage on targets. However, my brothers in Christ, may I suggest the Galahorn for the exact same thing but for more upfront damage. The Colony has got to be one of the most creative exotics Bungie has ever made. And yes, it is very viable as an exotic heavy in PvP. I want to propose some changes that make it better in PvE because anything above C tier in PvP is honestly fine. It probably doesn't need a buff. This seems to be aimed at as like a crowd control tool, right? So let's not overthink this and let's just give it volatile rounds after kills. Seems fair enough, I think. What are some exotics I missed? Did you agree with my list? Let me know in the comments down below or just hit it with a like and a sub. Bless your faces. Deuces.